This next panel is about the space between documentary film and journalism and the legal protections that exist in this country, which are very robust normally, but there are sort of tactics that are used to sometimes chip away at those protections. And one of them that surfaced thanks to one of our panelists, Trevor Aaronson, experienced this, was kind of redefining journalism or documentary film to not be considered journalism, and that's what he's going to be telling you about. Leading this panel is the moderator is Patricia Aufderheide. She is over here in the front row, a firebrand, and I don't think we can actually do DX without Pat being on a panel each year. She's just like such a faithful friend of the festival, so thank you. And Pat is a University Professor of Communications at American University. She's a founder of the Center for Media and Social Impact, which a lot of you will know, and a senior research fellow. Her latest book, which I have here and which you can pick up at the back later, is Kartemquin Films, Documentaries on the Front Lines of Democracy, over here. She is going to introduce her panel, which has some really incredible people on it.
All right, my friends, let's get organized here. I'm not being here alone. Come on, people. We need another chair. And we need another arrangement. We need to cuddle a little bit more than we are. Okay, and while we're waiting, can our wonderful volunteers give everybody a flyer for my book? Thank you very much. So this flyer gives you 30% off. But if you want an even better deal, you can buy it here. So it is really an honor and a pleasure to be leading this panel here today. What we're going to be talking about is something that is actually an old and familiar topic for anybody who's been around this area of the world, which is, are documentaries journalism? That should not be a head scratcher. But that has become an issue in a way that we were kind of hoping it wouldn't. And we're going to talk about that today. So I have a bunch of experts. I want to introduce them to you. But before I do that, I want to turn to you. Yes, you. I'm looking at you. Good. Now, what I'd like to know is, what do you want out of this panel? These people are brilliant. They have tons of information. Most of it will not be delivered to you. But if they know what you are interested in, they can really target that. What burning question did you bring, other than our documentaries journalism? Because we will answer that. Yes? Good. What's your question?
When covering a story where there's... Hi, I'm Christopher Carter with the mic not on. It's on. Check 1, 2. Now it is. Thank you. My name is Christopher Carter. I'm covering a story right now with ongoing litigation. The trial has concluded, but there's a pending appeal. How does a journalist adequately covering this without getting arrested for tampering?
Okie doke. We're going to... keep that in mind. Other questions? And don't forget, we can't answer, the lawyers on this panel cannot answer individual questions about your case.
Hi, my name is Jen Gation. I have a film tonight called Men of War. Our last screening had the prosecutors in the case attended, and they said something along the lines of that there were a lot of admissions of interest to them, and I'd like to know about subpoenas and how to protect oneself from helping to convict your subject.
We have a couple of people here who have organizations that do that kind of thing, so they can tell you about their organization, even if they can't give you individual advice right here. Other questions? Okay, so yes.
Why is it so important to keep having this conversation?
Correct. Okay, June Cross. Why is it so important to keep having this conversation? I hope we make our case to you today, June. Other questions? All right, those are good questions to start out. Yes.
I would just like to say I'm kind of really dying to hear the details on what happened in Trevor's case, because I think that kicked off this whole conversation. So I would just really love to hear from Trevor directly about like what was the thing that really, was at stake, and why does it matter so much?
And there goes Diana keeping us on target. Okay, now let me introduce you to the people who are on the panel. Trevor Aaronson is an investigative journalist who's covered the FBI for a decade, and he's written for The Intercept, and he is the author of The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism, and he's also done documentary podcasts. Our speaker right after Trevor will be Gordon Quinn. Gordon Quinn, aside from being one of my oldest friends, and we're both very old, is the founder of Cartemquin Films, the place I just wrote a whole book about, and a place that has done a lot of documentaries that are also journalism. We're turning then to Seth Stern, who's Director of Advocacy for Freedom of the Press Foundation, and before that, a seasoned lawyer. And finally, Kathleen McClellan, who is co-founder and Deputy Director for the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program, which is known as WHISPER, at Expose Facts, another organization you want to keep an open tab on if you're doing this kind of work. And she also is a licensed attorney. So let's go first to our first journalist, Trevor, to ask, what happened? Our documentaries journalism, why does this have to be an issue? June wants to know.
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me. The irony, of course, in this, and I'll explain a little bit, is that I'm not a documentary filmmaker, but somehow found my place in defending documentary journalism as journalism. And the backstory of this, and it's complicated, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'll give the cliff notes. If you're interested in more details, and I'm happy to share court filings, please come to me afterwards. I was reporting on a case in Michigan involving a young man who'd been charged with material support. That man was related to a guy named Russell Dennison, who I did a documentary podcast for Audible about, who'd gone to Syria and joined the Islamic State as a fighter. And there were I knew a lot of connections about Russell and this man, Aus Nasser, from my previous reporting. And after my series came out, the Justice Department charged him with material support, alleging a number of facts that I knew to be quite questionable given my previous reporting. And so I'd reached out to Aus while he was in detention on these federal charges, and we started communicating over months through calls in jail. I knew obviously that those calls were recorded and that they could be listened to. And there was a quirk in the government's case in the sense that they had established a protective order over the evidence, but that protective order did not prohibit Aus from going and looking at these documents in his case and then calling me up and telling me what was in them. In recorded calls, obviously. And I was in a unique position of having some of those documents from the FBI from my previous reporting so I could corroborate some of what he was telling me. And so I didn't know what this story was. Aus and I, it's been 2 years now that Aus and I have communicated, and I didn't know if I was writing a magazine story, if I was making a documentary podcast, or if it would become something else. And Aus, because he was familiar with American ISIS, the series I did for Audible, as a shorthand was referring to his friends, or referring to me when he talked to his friends as I was producing a documentary. And so the Justice Department made the assumption that I was making a documentary film about Aus's case, even though I wasn't sure quite what this was. And initially, the Justice Department pretty quickly was angered that we were communicating, basically was alleging that Aus was sharing government secrets with me. And they went to the judge and asked for essentially a gag order, although the Justice Department didn't quite want to call it that. And the judge refused to give it. The Justice Department then played a game of chicken with Aus, where they were refusing to give him more information. And Aus just decided to sit in detention until they provided him with more information. And then they started providing him with more information. They separately made a couple of attacks against me that weren't very egregious, but were just alleging to the judge that there was a problem with Alice's communications with me, that I was going to release to the public this very secret government information. And then finally, in what seemed like a moment of exasperation for the government, because they were frustrated that Alice and I were continuing to communicate, they wrote essentially like a 30-page filing as part of an evidentiary hearing. And I should be clear that the reason that the government was frustrated at this point was that part of a backstory of a lot of my work is that I look at how the FBI uses what's called an assessment to launch investigations, and assessments are a post-9/11 power that allow them to open an investigation without a criminal predicate. So they can basically use speech as a predicate to launch an investigation. And there were questions about whether Alice's First and Fourth Amendment rights had been violated in this government investigation. And the documents he was telling me about were related to these issues. And so that's when the government issued a filing that quoted directly from a number of the recordings, our recorded conversations, and basically alleged that I had, quote, improper motives in speaking with Alice, and that Alice and I were colluding to taint the jury to forever make it difficult for the government to move forward in this prosecution. And then the most alarming thing was that because the government had internalized and made a number of assumptions that I was making a documentary film, even though I was not at that time, they then kind of made this broad attack on documentary journalism. And their argument was that, this is a rough quote, was that unlike a traditional news story, which is based on kind of, more contemporaneous findings and is not in-depth, a documentary basically has an emotional resonance and comes from a point of view that makes it somehow not journalism. And so that was their allegation. And so what we immediately did was retain counsel in Michigan to submit a letter. We considered a motion to intervene, but we felt like at the time we did not have a lot of enough time to do that. And so we submitted a letter to the judge and to the prosecutors and the defense lawyers, in part correcting a number of false information that was alleged about me in these filings, and also correcting a number of the wild assumptions that the government had made, including their claim that they knew exactly what I was doing and what type of journalism I would be making. And so in that hearing, I was hoping to attend. Our lawyers suggested I did not in case I would be called as a witness. The government did backtrack a little bit. They claimed that their attacks were more against the defendant than against me, even though that was kind of patently untrue. And so, at the moment, nothing's come of it further. Alice is still fighting this case. Alice and I are still communicating. And so far, they have not made any kind of further allegations against me. But the troubling aspect of this, and I think, for me specifically, was that given, for the last 10 or so years, I've been reporting about how in terrorism investigations, we're seeing kind of a criminalization of speech in the process by which assessments or investigations that don't have probable cause are being opened. It was the first time, I guess, for me personally, that I'd felt that the abuses that I'd spent years documenting were, somehow kind of personally affecting me for the first time. This idea that, if the government is taking its time to write a 30-page filing, like how much more effort does it take to launch an investigation? And the other thing that I think is really important to mention is that this is a case that was based in Michigan, but this wasn't an issue where this was some local yokel prosecutor who, was going too far. The prosecutor who wrote the filing is based here in D.C. at Main Justice and is part of the National Security Division. And so, I can't say for certain like what levels of approval this had within the Justice Department, but certainly that he's based in Washington kind of, for me, raised even further alarms. And obviously, now with Trump's election, I think, this kind of issue is even more pressing, where we're kind of wondering to what degree, this kind of behavior will be criminalized or looked at, as not journalism.
Great. We have a clip that Trevor gave us as well to illustrate this.
I'm not speaking on behalf of the Islamic State or speaking for them, but I'm speaking about my life, and I would like to record...
Russell Dennison was an American who joined the Islamic State, or ISIS, as a fighter in Syria.
But if this information was to be released while I am alive, it could potentially make a very dangerous situation for me with the security forces.
I'm Trevor Aaronson. For months, Russell secretly communicated with me, telling me about his conversion to Islam, his life in the United States, and his journey to the Middle East, and ultimately, to the world's most feared terrorist organization.
So as soon as we were like walking across the border, you could hear the bombs, the missiles, the bullets, everything, the tanks. So I thought to myself, Allah Akbar, where am I going? And there's no turning back.
Russell's recordings provide an astonishing first-hand account of what it was like for an American in the Islamic State. From The Intercept and Topic Studios, this is American ISIS, an Audible original.
Okay. And I want to turn to another maker on the panel, Gordon Quinn, who has executive produced and directed many films that have journalistic aspects. But first, I want to show a reel that shows you what Cartemquin is, in case that word is a little unfamiliar to you.
First question's easy. Are you happy?
How much will the union get us? We always said it's your fault. It's your fault.
Mr. Clay,
Muhammad Ali, sir.
Mr. Clay,
Muhammad Ali, sir.
Mr.
Who does this baby belong to?
I can't be out here like this. I gotta get better
for me,
for myself.
the movies are like a machine that generates empathy.
There should be some coming.
So, Gordon, are your films journalism?
Well, you know, you write about it in your book. I wrote about it in my BA paper, which I probably wrote 50-some years ago, or 60 or whatever. I view documentaries as an essential part of a democracy. Somebody in the previous panel said, you need to tell stories that move people emotionally. That's what we do. And what's so frightening about the story that Trevor told, even on the edge of journalism, they're coming after you saying you're a documentary filmmaker because your films create emotion. And so I think that the thread is very important. I think that the kind of communications that a democracy needs are multiple. Data is one kind of thing, but that emotional storytelling is critical. And so I have always felt that the fundamental way in which we work is a necessary part of the documentary process, that kind of emotional storytelling is fundamentally important to a documentary. So the underlying principles for the journalistic protections are exactly the same for documentary. One other point I'll make is that the kind of detail investigation that you do, we often do in a documentary. And yet what you see on the screen is maybe an image of something that we found a data point. My recent film, For the Left Hand, the principal character tells us about a horrific attack that happened to him and resulted in his paralysis by his father 50 years ago. Well, Howard went and found, he looked and he looked. It's like we needed to know if this was true. And he found...
You have to tell us who Howard is.
Howard Reich was the journalist who we were working with on this story, who really uncovered this story. He found a little clipping in the Chicago Defender newspaper about this incident. And it was like, now we know it's true, and now we have an image for our film. So I think that there are lots of reasons why we have to defend this idea of the journalistic protection. Also, just as Trevor described, we sometimes have incredibly sensitive material in our footage that could be extremely damaging to characters that we've developed a relationship with over the years, and we need to protect them.
So have you, let me just do one follow-up question before we move on to our legal experts. Have you ever needed that journalistic protection in any of the films that you've done?
The threat has always been there, and about 10 years ago, I had some lawyers that do the kind of thing that you do come in to talk, because we work with a group of filmmakers, and you know, it was basically a presentation about what to do if if somebody shows up on your doorstep. We have had a few situations where there have been inquiries, and we try to make people understand the first thing you say is, very nice to hear from you, nice to meet you, you should be talking to my lawyer.
And remind me, was there anything in Abacus that created issues? Abacus is a film about a small bank that was sued by the feds, right?
And that's a good film to bring up, because this question of journalistic objectivity or documentary objectivity, I think it's the wrong question. Where you stand makes a difference. If you stand behind a police line, you get one kind of story. If you stand on the other side of that police line with whether it's civil rights demonstrations or whatever the issue is, you get a different story. And so we need to understand that we stand in a place. Abacus was about a family that was accused, a banking family, and they were the only bank that the government went after for the financial meltdown, the recent one, this tiny little Chinatown bank, and the family fought back. So we're following in real time their case as it unfolds. But through the whole course of making that film, we kept approaching these prosecutors with the typical journalistic line, which is, we want you to tell your side of the story. Yes, we're standing with the family. You guys know that. But we want to hear your side of the story. We finally got that interview with them. We're working with Frontline, and Frontline wants to make sure we're ticking all of those journalistic boxes. But sometimes with a documentary, people look at it, we did Hoop Dreams, and they look at the film and they don't understand that we may have a file cabinet full of the research that we've done that stands behind the very emotional story that we are telling. I just want to mention one other thing about this emotional aspect, because it came up in the previous panel, which is Hoop Dreams was a 3-hour film that a lot of people saw. And a lot of people saw that film who would never watch a film about a social issue. But Hoop Dreams was about basketball and sports and family. And people spent 3 hours with people that they would never come to know except through a film like Hoop Dreams.
Great. And one of the things I want to take away as we turn to Seth is the fact that Frontline produces documentaries every week that are clearly journalism and are aligned with some of the strictest journalism standards in the business. So turning to Seth, Seth is a member of, he's the advocacy director, as you recall, for Freedom of the Press. Freedom of the Press really is a truly heroic organization, and I'm really honored to be sitting next to you. So talk to us about how officials have tried to limit who qualifies as a journalist, and what's behind that?
Sure. It's great to be here. I'll start by talking about what journalism is before I talk about what prosecutors sometimes think it isn't. The way we at Freedom of the Press Foundation look at journalism is it is an act, not a job title. It is a functional definition. Journalism is gathering and disseminating news of public concern to people who want to receive it. Now, that has nothing to do with whether the journalist is objective or neutral. Those are questions about norms of journalism, ethics of journalism, standards of journalism, but they have nothing to do with whether you are a journalist. Whether you're a good journalist is a totally different debate than whether you are a journalist. It also has nothing to do with whether you do journalism full-time, whether it's your job. That's particularly important now with the financial situation the news media finds itself in. People are going to need to moonlight as journalists. People need to pay the bills. So if we're limiting journalistic protections to full-time employees of a recognized news outlet, as those recognized news outlets are going under, that is going to cause a lot of problems for the First Amendment. On paper, the government and the Department of Justice, the federal prosecutors in particular, mostly agree with what I'm saying to the extent that they have defined journalism in writing, in policies, and even in legislation. The definition is broad and functional, or at least should be. But in practice, it doesn't work exactly like that. When convenient, prosecutors look to find wiggle room where they can. One of the questions was about the reporter's privilege. Now, in cases involving documentary filmmakers, there is a line of cases creating even additional wiggle room to what applies to others. This started with a documentary about Chevron and its subsidiary then, Texaco, and its pollution of the rainforests in Ecuador, where prosecutors made the argument, and the judge accepted the argument, that documentary films were only journalism and only entitled to a reporter's privilege if the filmmaker were independent, to the extent that the filmmaker is collaborating too closely with the subject of the documentary, or in that case with attorneys for the subject of the documentary, they lose their protection. They no longer fall under the umbrella of journalism. Now, that's a theory that would never fly with conventional news reporting, with print journalism. Nobody would suggest that if a story is driven by a tip from a news source and the journalist works closely with the tipster, that story loses its protection. I mean, that's how journalism works. But it goes to this point that there is this feeling, I guess, maybe from prosecutors who haven't spent a lot of time watching documentaries, that they're a lesser form of journalism. I've never, before Trevor's case, I had never heard the theories that documentaries should lose protection for being too good, too compelling, too detailed. That is a new one that I hope is a one-off, because that's bizarre. But there is this feeling that they're somehow different. I mean, the whole idea that we have courts across the country, including the highest court, that won't allow cameras in, they recognize they need to be open to print journalists. They recognize there needs to be transcripts for journalists to report from, but it just shows a lack of appreciation for the value of a documentary, for the value of visual journalism. So, we've got this line of cases that limits the reporter's privilege to journalists who are too close to their sources, or documentarians who are too close to their sources. That's been used with some success, and sometimes, fortunately, the courts have gotten it right. There was a case involving Sarah Byrne's documentary on the Central Park Five, where prosecutors attempted the same tactic, but the judge rejected it, found that she was adequately independent. But the point is, she shouldn't have to prove independence in the first place. That's an artificial standard that only applies to documentary filmmakers. Another recent thing that's come up, which is less of a legal issue and more of something in the public discourse from the journalism community, but those things often do sort of infect the legal system as well, because prosecutors hear the zeitgeist and judges do too. Earlier this year, I'm sure all read headlines when Lauren Windsor recorded Justice Alito at this secret gala, basically admitting to being an ideologue who sees the country as immersed in this battle between good and evil, the good being the religious right, the evil being, not to assume anyone's politics, but probably most people in this room. And she didn't break the law, because it was a one-party state where she was entitled to record someone under the law, under the wiretapping laws. But there was this pushback that I found really disturbing from journalists, from the journalistic establishment. I'm not sure if there was the same pushback from the documentary filmmaking segment of the journalism world. I'm a little less plugged in there. But the journalistic establishment was almost reported more on her ethics than the really, really significant news that she broke, and really dragged her across the coals for secretly recording Justice Alito to get this news that she really couldn't have gotten any other way. And it's especially going into a second Trump term, where transparency is going to likely be minimal, and every effort will be made to seal off conventional sources of obtaining news. We don't need that kind of gatekeeping. And the thing is, undercover journalism used to be commonplace. Anyone who is as old as I am or older remembers turning on news every night and seeing undercover reports. I'm from Chicago, where the Chicago Sun-Times created a fake bar, the Mirage Tavern, just to catch city officials doing shady stuff. This undercover news stories won Pulitzer Prizes in the past, or at least were nominated for them, I think won. And what changed it wasn't some ethical, epiphany. It was a court case, the Food Lion case, where that opened the door to liability under various tort theories for undercover journalism. At the time, that was viewed as a bad thing, as an infringement on the First Amendment. Journalists didn't like that, but slowly they have sort of repackaged this unfortunate legal decision as this norm that can't be violated. And that to me, even though it hasn't gotten to the judicial level yet, I bet it does one day, and that's going to be a problem, I think, for undercover journalists going forward. There are plenty of other ways to limit the definition of journalism that arise from cases involving non-documentary filmmakers, but apply equally to documentary filmmakers. The Julian Assange case is one great example where he was prosecuted to a guilty plea for gathering and disseminating government secrets to the public, something that documentary filmmakers do all the time. There was a case involving a journalist in Florida, Tim Burke, who obtained outtakes from a Tucker Carlson interview with Kanye West, or Ye, where Ye went on an anti-Semitic rant that Fox chose not to broadcast. He's being prosecuted under computer fraud laws, essentially for finding information using the internet that Fox didn't want published. He found it on a site. It was a well-hidden site, but it was a site that if you had the URL, you could put it in your browser right now and get to it. So look, documentary filmmakers do online journalism and digital journalism too. So that's a problem for all of us that prosecutors are pursuing that. In Burke's case, he undisputably has a journalistic background. He worked for Deadspin. He broke the Manti Te'o story, the catfishing story. So he's a guy with a strong journalistic background, but they're making the argument that because he is not employed full-time as a journalist right now, because he mostly works as a consultant and does other things and doesn't put journalist in his LinkedIn profile, basically, that he is no longer entitled to rely on the First Amendment. Seeing prosecutors say things like that is quite troubling, whether you make documentaries, news reports, whatever it may be. Last point I wanted to make, getting back to the reporter's privilege thing, I talked about the wiggle room coming from this independence test, and there's plenty of other wiggle room on the reporter's privilege I can get into. There is a pending bill, the Press Act, that would solve that problem. It would establish an almost ironclad reporter's privilege so that journalists can't be surveilled or forced to burn their sources. It has bipartisan support, but is sort of hung up in committee right now. We're pushing for it to be passed during the lame duck session. We think there's a chance that could happen. I'm not going to say it's not an uphill battle, but it could happen, and it could solve a lot of those problems that journalists and documentarians face when it comes to protecting their sources. So if you work with an organization, a company that has lobbyists, that has DC connections, particularly with the right side of the aisle, particularly Senators Cornyn, Kennedy, and Cotton, please activate them. It's a full court press for the next couple months to get this bill passed.
So, Seth, I just have a couple of follow-up questions. First of all, the case that Trevor was involved in, is that precedent-setting?
Not at this point, but if the prosecutor's comments that Trevor described well were to end up in a judicial opinion at some point, and if the worst case scenario, if that opinion were to be appealed and an appellate court were to sort of parrot that reasoning, it could be precedent setting. At this point, it is not. There is no judicial rule that other courts can cite saying that documentary filmmakers who explore their stories in too much detail and persuade their audience a little bit too well lose their protection, that you need to do a worse job if you want to be a journalist. That is not the law of the land right now, but still it's something that judges and other prosecutors, that's the real concern, other prosecutors are going to see that argument has been made, and it normalizes it. The fact that it even exists, by federal, and was filed by a federal prosecutor who is not only under a duty to represent the government, but to uphold the Constitution, is that's a big problem.
So Seth, the other follow-up I wanted to make was a conclusion I'm drawing from your remarks generally, which, one of the things that typifies most filmmakers is that they would like to not have any legal trouble, right? They would like to stay well within the law. When we were working on fair use, and Gordon and I worked on making fair use more available to documentary filmmakers, a huge problem was that people were like, but can I do it? And one of the points we always wanted to make was, like, you have rights, and if you don't use them, you won't have them. And it sounds to me like you're saying some of that please remember that you have this special role in society, and you have these rights, and defend them. Am I taking that away from your remarks fairly?
Yeah, I think that's a fair takeaway, and I would also say that there are a lot of resources available to journalists who are unsure of their legal rights. The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press has a legal hotline. The Society of Professional Journalists has a legal defense fund. There's Lawyers for Reporters. There are ACLU chapters, both at the state and national level, that help journalists and also documentary filmmakers who do journalism who are in need, and avail yourselves of those resources, whether it be looking at what exists online, and I should also mention Whistleblower and Whisper and other organizations like those that protect whistleblowers who work with journalists. Avail yourselves of the online resources that can be informative if you need to. If there's an actual legal situation, avail yourselves of pro bono legal services that are out there. Don't think that just because you are a documentary filmmaker, the resources out there for the quote-unquote press won't be there for you, and that the people who defend the press won't be there to defend you. We recognize, no matter what anyone's personal feelings are about this journalist or this filmmaker or that filmmaker, we recognize that when a precedent is set, it binds everybody. And when we see the legal rights of journalists in general in danger, we will help, not necessarily because of our feelings about the work you do, but because of its implications for journalism at large. So please don't think that you're excluded from that pool of resources.
Right, and just to reinforce that, Reporters Committee on Freedom of the Press actually has a program with the International Documentary Association. Is Brian here? The IDA to provide pre-production legal services to documentary filmmakers involved in a journalistic project. So we are at Kathleen McClellan, who is at another truly awesome organization, Expose Facts, and works with whistleblowers. And Kathleen, tell us about what are the implications of these attacks on journalistic freedom?
I should not have gone last after all of these brilliant speakers. I have to say that Trevor's case calls to mind a mistake I made in my very first moot court, which was I jumped up and said, "Objection!" And the judge said, "Grounds?" And I said, "I don't know, but it's very bad for my case." And that was embarrassing at the time. It was just practice. But the government redefining journalism in order to stifle the flow of information to the public is not new. This has been happening for decades, where the government will redefine what someone is doing or who someone is. Many of our clients are whistleblowers from within the intelligence community. The government has never called them whistleblowers. They've been called leakers, they've been called traitors, they've been called terrorist sympathizers, material support givers. And so the reason the government doesn't want them defined as whistleblowers is because that has a positive connotation. And so that is why the government is taking all of these actions. And that's why it's so dangerous, because the result will be that we, the public, will be less informed about what our government is doing. And in the national security context, it's especially dangerous, because the courts are very deferential to the government when it comes to national security. Even defining the information, what information is classified, that is something that the government almost has unilateral authority to define, and the courts can do very little to question it. So when you have a journalist working in this area, or a documentary filmmaker, or anybody doing the acts of journalism that Seth described, and you have the government trying to redefine that person, you essentially have the fox telling the hens that they should come out of the house. Come on out, guys. It's safe. I'm not going to eat you. I'm not a fox. You cannot have the entity that wants the information kept secret defining the information, who's giving the information, and who's telling the story. That is not what investigative journalism is supposed to do. And so at my organization, the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program, we facilitate investigative journalism in the public interest by giving pro bono legal representation to the sources. And we also give legal advice to journalists and documentary filmmakers about how to better protect their sources. And
just say that last sentence again. Listen up, people.
we give advice to documentary filmmakers and journalists about how to protect their sources. I'll be here for the next 2 days. And I also think, I'm really glad that Seth brought up the Assange prosecution, because that has such wide-ranging implications for journalism. Because that law, the Espionage Act, does not distinguish between government employees, former employees, journalists, non-journalists, WikiLeaks employees, documentary filmmakers, or any of us sitting in this room, and it is broad, and it applies to retention, dissemination, and disclosure, retention and dissemination of information. So there's actually no legal protection from a prosecution under the Espionage Act for any of us right now, except for things like the First Amendment. And when you think about what is coming down given the election, when you think about what the president-elect has said that he is going to do, it is more necessary than ever that we shore up the legal protections for journalists and for their sources. Because if those sources are risking prison to speak out, those sources will dry up.
Have we missed anybody's video? Is there more video? I think we did all the video. Okay, great. Guess what? Questions?
Yeah, you guys can't tell I'm a reporter, right? What is the DOJ's definition of journalism?
It is a long and multi-factor test, and I can't recite all 10 factors in the test right now, but they include the purpose of the work, the public interest in the work, whether the person has a history of doing journalism, and a number of other things. In and of itself, the test on paper is, I think, okay. No factor is dispositive. It's like a balancing test. You look at these 10 factors and look at whether in totality this person is operating as a journalist. But like any multi-factor test in the law, as we've seen in any number of areas of law, it provides prosecutors with enough wiggle room to find a factor to conveniently emphasize in any one particular case, like the Tim Burke case, where his lack of recent bylines and journalism employment is elevated above the others. So it provides enough wiggle room for prosecutors to make these self-serving judgment calls to say, well, this person's not a journalist because we don't want them to be. And again, that's why the Press Act is so important. It does not provide that wiggle room. Anyone who regularly gathers and reports news is a journalist.
Just a quick follow-up. Who grades this test?
Who what?
Who grades this test or evaluates this test? Is that Merrick Garland?
Usually it would just be the local prosecutor. It's a policy. It's not legally binding. It is a policy. So it would be a local prosecutor making a determination of whether to bring the charges. The policy does say that in close cases, in difficult cases that are that are on the where local prosecutors are on the fence, they should elevate the decision to the acting attorney general for the criminal division.
We have another question right here.
What are you pointing at?
You, right?
Thank you very much. My name is Lauren Harper. I work with Seth at FPF. My question is for Trevor, and it's about the FBI assessments that you mentioned. Is there any public reporting requirement for the number of assessments that are opened every year? For example, I'm basically wondering if it's possible to track trends in their use over time.
Yeah, I wish there were. Yeah, there isn't. I mean, under the law doesn't create a time definition for assessments. What the FBI says, and I don't think this is always true in cases, is that they have a 72-hour clock to get a predicate in order to further the investigation. I mean, anecdotally, I found a number of cases where it doesn't appear that they got the predicate within 72 hours, but unfortunately they don't report assessments. What the FBI says publicly is that these happen so frequently and often result in no case, just someone calling up saying my neighbor has a bomb that requires an assessment, and so they just don't report that publicly, at least as far as I know of.
You could file a FOIA request maybe, but other than that, you're not.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
gotcha. Thank you.
I would like to ask the panel your opinion. When does your job end and the advocacy or the justice begins from the subject matter of the film or reporting?
It's a good question for you.
Well, in one sense, it can never end. When you spend 5-7 years in somebody's life, you have a responsibility to them in these particular areas. We are still involved 30 years later, with the Hoop Dreams boys and their families, both on a financial basis and in other ways. And I think that these limiting factors, so something that's being discussed in the documentary field is the whole question of subjects benefiting from the film. Well, that becomes problematic from the narrow definition of what journalism is. And I think we have to be aware of the fact that documentary filmmaking is, the journalism that the DOJ sets up, they want it to be as narrow as it can be. We want to say that what we do has a critical role to play in a democracy, and therefore these standards have to include our practice and our ethics. I just say that.
Yeah, along those lines, what I would add is, in this particular case where the government attacked me in the filing, one of the arguments that they'd made was that, or reading between the lines, they were basically saying that I'm not a journalist, I'm an advocate / propagandist maybe. And what their argument was that if you look at the body of work, that I am largely critical of the FBI and its tactics, and that somehow made me biased. And the truth is that I know the FBI does good work, right? They find kidnapped children, they find bank robbers, they find corrupt politicians, but that's just not what I do, right? Other journalists do that great, and I'm not saying that isn't a role that the FBI has. They do good work, but they made it seem that because of essentially the beat that I cover, that I'm most interested in documenting FBI abuses, that I somehow am biased against the FBI and I'm an advocate against the FBI, which is not true, but also that they were kind of using that idea of like putting the advocacy mantle on me to basically say that I'm less than as a journalist.
One of the issues that we have faced over the years is this accusation of bias, which is always often coming from the fact that we pointed our camera in this direction for a long time. And that people can consider bias when it's really just recording what's happening in front of the camera and how we put it together to tell the story.
I would also add that the
Is your mic on?
I think it is.
It is. I would also add that the entity being held accountable should not be the one to determine whether there is bias.
And just to get in on this one, I would add that bias doesn't matter. When the First Amendment was drafted, when the press clause of the First Amendment was drafted, nobody was thinking about bias. There was no such thing as objective media. The people that it was intended to protect were very much political, revolutionaries, in fact. The notion of journalistic objectivity seeped into the discourse with the advent of mass media, where wire services like the Associated Press wanted to create a product that would appeal to folks both in New York and in Alabama. And the best way to do that was going down the middle. And that became the norm, the philosophy of journalism. Like what I was talking about before with undercover reporting, it's a case of what started as a business consideration over time somehow morphing in to the be-all, end-all of journalistic ethics. And then what becomes an ethical consideration in turn morphs into a legal one, where prosecutors make these arguments that people who have biases aren't entitled to the same protections as those who don't. That was never the intention of any of this.
Did you want to? You look like you wanted to go. So this is entering into this very big discussion about what happened to objectivity, and I'm just about completing a study analyzing codes of ethics of major journalism organizations, and objectivity has become a rare word because I think it has become seen as a fig leaf for straight out ideology. So I think the other way to look at this is you decided to tell people something because you thought it was important. And there's some reason why you thought it was important. You should probably share with those people why you think it's important. Transparency really becoming an important ethical issue and a guideline for being respectful and fair with readers about where you're coming from, as opposed to pretending that you are the journalist from Mars. Yes.
Pat, I just want to jump in because I think is there going to be a panel on AI here, but yes. It came up around the food guy.
Anthony Bourdain.
Yeah, Anthony Bourdain, and I was called by the New York Times for a comment.
Roadrunner.
Yeah, and
Morgan Neville.
Basically what I said was, well, the problem is he wasn't transparent about what he had done. He hid it from the audience. We did a film about Roger Ebert. We had started before he died, and the film came after he died. You have an actor reading his voice. You have Ebert with his mechanical thing, creating a voice. We always are transparent with the audience. And I think just from our own perspective, transparency is an important aspect. And that's what we mean by objectivity. I think people confuse these two things. Objectivity doesn't exist. As soon as you point the camera one way and not another, you have made a decision. And you can't point there. If you're shooting with one camera, you're not looking in both directions at once and you're not telling a story. And so transparency is a key issue, I think, to help protect yourself and to be kind of in that compact that we have with the audience, that we're saying the story we are telling you is honest and we're trying to do it with transparency, which doesn't mean that we stand somewhere. We do stand somewhere.
So we have a couple of minutes left. I'm dying to get to one more question. Before we do, I just want to mention that another organization I'm associated with, Documentary Accountability Working Group, has a website, docaccountability.org, and some really great insights about people grappling with just the issues that Gordon was talking about. Last question. You. Yeah, you. Yeah. Film tonight.
Thank you.
Come to the film.
Thank you to everybody on the panel. I wanted to ask a question, which is how does one go about documenting someone in an active criminal case? Because to Gordon's point, you live with your subject for beyond the time of which you've documented them. I carry a huge responsibility. So I'm just curious, what protections are there for, every lawyer is going to tell the defendant, do not talk on camera, do not do it. And you're basically saying, no, I'm going to do right by you. I'm curious if journalists have any, maybe Kathleen can speak to that.
I mean, we've confronted that in the past. I think, we've had media done by clients who were in the middle of their criminal cases. And in fact, when we represented Daniel Hale, the drone whistleblower, he was being filmed for a documentary when he was raided by the FBI and was actually initiated our involvement. And so I think there is a way to do it safely, but it is very delicate. I think one thing that works for us is that we don't actually handle the criminal defense case ourselves. So we provide a legal advice to the source outside of the criminal defense lawyer. And I think you have to take a view of client interest broadly. Many clients want to speak, and that's their goal. And as an attorney, taking a respectful view of their goals can help facilitate investigative journalism safely. However, when somebody is under criminal investigation, there are times where the advice may be, okay, now you cannot talk, or you can film, but it doesn't come out until after the criminal trial is done. So there are ways to facilitate it. I think having lawyers involved representing all the different parties, having a lawyer representing the filmmaker, having a lawyer representing the source, enhances the protections. That said, with a Justice Department that is aggressive, there is almost no way to be completely secure. There's not like a guarantee that you could get from a lawyer that will say, everyone will be okay for sure at the end of this.
I'm going to turn to Seth for the last comment on the pen, really quick, because we're running out of time.
One brief thing. One thing that we have said to people is that particular very sensitive piece of footage, make sure that it's not where someone could just bust in and get it. They can subpoena you, they can do things, and then you're in the courts. But once they have their hands on it, you're in a much weaker position.
So the last comment goes to Seth.
Really picking up on what Gordon said, digital security, encrypted communications. Freedom of the Press Foundation, where I work, offers digital security training to journalists, and we've worked with plenty of documentary filmmakers on exactly those matters. Where the law falls short, and it often does, digital security is going to be key. When it comes to the reporter's privilege, there is a patchwork of protections. Every federal circuit of appeals sees the reporter's privilege differently. Every state sees the reporter's privilege differently. Not knowing where a case may end up, it's very difficult for a journalist to assure a source that the law will protect them. You really can't, because you don't know what the law is going to be wherever the case is heard. So the source really is taking your word that you're willing to do whatever it takes, that you're willing to go to jail for them if it comes down to it. And plenty of journalists have. The more journalists, unfortunately, who do that, the more sources are going to trust journalists. The more journalists give up their sources when they're faced with real personal risk, the less trust there is going to be in journalists. And it's just, in light of this week's news, it's really upsetting to us that the Biden administration not only didn't sort of Trump-proof the next 4 years when it comes to protecting journalists and their sources, but advanced novel theories, like the one in Trevor's case, that Trump is sure to abuse and use to make false equivalencies. So I don't know that that's a very helpful answer to your question, but the short answer is, for now, the law is inadequate, and you need to resort to other means to keep your sources safe.
And that's why we're really happy to be here today with people on this panel who've shown so much courage, and people in this audience who live that courageous challenge every day. Thank you very much. These people are here to answer your questions afterwards.